keeps you small.
Oh, I'm going to do that. Oh, but then, that doesn't help me not see myself, though.
I like speaking to you. That's good. Oh, we're on YouTube. I like speaking to you. That's good. Oh, we're on YouTube.
Oh, sorry, let me pause my notification. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. We're really excited that we were able to do this and allow 250 people to see the film for free. And we hope that most of you went out and streamed it anyway, because I think we're going to have a really great conversation today. Also want to thank Katie and Ruth for joining us today from Michigan and Wisconsin. How are y'all?
I'm good. I'm not actually in Wisconsin. I'm based out in the Boston area now.
I did not know that. Okay. Well, we will get to updates.
Really, in Wisconsin.
Yes, and I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was telling EJ earlier today, so I rewatched the movie. I can't remember when I first saw it. It was a while ago, but I rewatched it last night to prepare for this, and it just got me like going again. I was just like, this is crazy. This is not okay. You know, we need to do something about it. And, you know, I know you two are kind of coming from the vantage point of the two states that got most of the focus in the film, but I am from North Carolina. So I have been I started basically working in politics in August of 2010, right before the November 2010 midterms. And yeah, I've just seen, specifically I was working on the Hill, and I saw our House delegation go from 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans to 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats in a state that's pretty, you know, purple. So this just got me really fired up again. So, you know, I think gerrymandering has always been a problem, but after the 2010 elections, it's kind of been in our face for the past decade. So I would love to know for each of you, what was the thing or the moment that it hit you and you said, okay, I need to do something about this because it's not okay.
Go for it, Katie.
Yeah, well, so for me, my background was, you know, I was recently out of college. I was in sustainable business, which is like environmental, social-oriented business practices, worked in the grocery industry, worked in the recycling industry. So my life didn't really involve a lot of politics besides voting. I cared about voting, especially local voting. But in Michigan, you could just see that the decisions being made at the state level were so not in line with what the people actually wanted. The Flint water crisis, which is highlighted in the film, and the emergency manager law related to that was this law that took away local control, that the people of Michigan actually did a citizen's veto, overwhelmingly voted to get rid of this law. And then the first thing our newly gerrymandered in State House and Senate do is find a loophole and pass it anyways. And it wasn't even just the emergency manager law. That loophole meant that even if they attached a penny of money from the funds, that citizens couldn't overturn any law that they passed. And they started passing every law with at least $1 of appropriations attached to it. And hearing about that on the radio and seeing it, and then seeing the decisions and just how, I guess, cheap taking away our liberty was, that really for a couple $100 or $1,000 donation here or there, our legislators were so willing to give away citizens' right to actually hold our government accountable. I just couldn't take it anymore. And when I made the Facebook post, I didn't actually think I was going to do anything about it. I just, I make plenty of Facebook posts that are not leading to constitutional amendments or political movements. But it was just one of those things that forever, I'd learned about gerrymandering in school, and then I was seeing it over and over again. And I just was I have cared about this for a long time, but I think I've let myself get distracted by national politics, all while Michigan keeps making really horrible decisions locally. And to wake up tomorrow and go to work and know that a Flint water crisis too, whatever city that would be, could still happen, I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't go to work knowing that an entire city was poisoned and the children were poisoned and nobody was taking accountability or doing anything. And even worse, that it could happen all over again. So that's why I was well, have no idea what I'm doing, but we'll try. And seeing that other people were feeling that way too. I think that's really what ended up solidifying for me. Like, actually, I'm not the only one who feels this way, even though I think I previously kind of felt that way. I was like, doesn't anybody care about gerrymandering? Didn't know Ruth. And so then to see that, that's when I think I really started taking it seriously then too, of like, wow, a lot of us care, and maybe we do have more power than we think.
Yeah. What about you, Ruth?
Yeah, so my story is kind of different. I grew up in Australia, as you can probably hear, and I came over to the US in 2008 to study constitutional law. I was in New York. My aim was to be here for 10 months and go home, but it was 2008. And I was like, I mean, yeah, Obama's amazing. Why don't I get on that? And so I volunteered with the law school Democrats, and I was like, look, if this accent's a problem, like, I can do whatever. And they were like, oh, just do voter protection. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, am I like reviving them or something? But no, so I went down to Prince William County in Virginia, and they were like, we're trying to make sure everyone votes. Doesn't matter if they're a Democrat, Republican, Independent. The point is just to help them to vote. And I mean, I always have loved voting in Australia. And in Australia, you have like, we call them sausage sizzles. So it's like a grill, like a cookout, and it's a big kind of party at the polls because everybody has to vote by law. And it's just, it's usually on a Saturday, kids are coming from sport. And so I was like, oh my goodness, America's so good at parties. Election day is going to be so great at the polls. Wow. And then I get there, and the weekend before the election, there were signs up in the black areas of town telling people that this was going to be a historic turnout election. And so Republicans should vote on Tuesday and Democrats should vote on Wednesday. And I was just like, are you fucking kidding me? I thought I came to the world's greatest democracy. Like, what? Anyway, and then, even though it was a rainy day, there was like a line around the corner and it was slow. There wasn't this big excitement. Like there were people that were excited, but there wasn't this sense of like, yay, we're all at the polls exercising our right to vote. It was like, please let me in. I really want to vote. Anyway, so I thought that I wanted to take election law and get involved in it. And then when I started studying it, I realized redistricting was just so wacky in America. In Australia, I'd heard of the term gerrymandering as like back in the 1950s, but then we got rid of it. We got an independent commission, I don't know, before I was born, and things have been fine. And honestly, like part of my staying in America originally was I'm going to learn about democratization and, all these great groups and bring that back, particularly to the South Pacific, where there's a lot of democratization work. But the more that I stayed here, the more I was like, wait a second, like, I feel like I'm an aid worker, like coming from Australia to help out this poor fledgling democracy. Anyway, and then there's also the thing of like, when America decides it's going off to the war in Iraq, my friend goes and serves, my little Australian from down the street in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Like what you do here really matters around the world. And so I don't feel totally like I'm in some foreign land. I feel like this is where this needs to work for the rest of the world to work. Anyway, so that's how I got into just the democracy space generally. This particular issue of redistricting, I mean, I've been banging on about it for ages, but didn't know how to find Katie. But actually, my husband's also, I guess he's in the film, he's a law professor and also loves redistricting, and we met at a redistricting conference. And Bill Whitford, who ended up being our lead plaintiff in our Wisconsin case, was a law professor, and he came across one of Nick's articles. And like, it is so rare as a redistricting lawyer to get a call like, I need help. Like if you do like wills or criminal or something, people are like, hi, I need help. Nobody rings up and says, I think there's been some malapportionment in my area. But Bill Whitford did that. He rang up and he was like, this is wrong. And you know why, and we're going to do something about it. And I was like, okay. There was this one moment towards the beginning where we'd filed the case and we sort of brought together plaintiffs and friends, and we were trying to build a campaign, and we were meeting with this prospective funder, and I hadn't done a lot of work with funders, and we met at this restaurant in Chicago where I lived at the time, and it was sort of like that scene from Charlie Wilson's War where they say like, who's the Afghanistan desk? And the guy's like, me and these other two guys. They were like, who's the campaign for this? And I was like, well, it's me and then Nick and also me. So that's the campaign. Anyway, so over time we expanded, and particularly working with other people in Wisconsin that were just fed up, right? Like when we started back in 2014, there was this sense like something was wrong, but connecting the policy to the gerrymander, people were like, oh, this is what's going wrong, right? This is what we can hopefully change to make things better.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you two saw it, got angry, and got involved. So at the top of this, I mentioned the 2010 elections kind of around the time that I started working in politics. But, after the elections, I was absorbing everything because I was new to politics. Democrats, the party I was working for, just lost pretty handedly in the midterms. And after that, there was a lot of analysis that, voters, specifically voters who created the Tea Party, were really upset that we had a Black president. And also, a lot of people were really upset that the Affordable Care Act had been passed, and just that, Republicans needed to be in charge to respond to a lot of this. And that was a big reason that they won, not just in Congress, but also down ballot. But then, as I was watching the documentary, hearing Chris Jankowski talk about Red Map, I sat there and I was like, okay, yes, Democrats have some fault in this, but there was so much more going on that I don't think a lot of people knew. My first question is, did you all know anything about Red Map before the documentary? And if not, did that surprise you or change kind of what you thought about what happened in 2010?
I think I knew a little about it. Like I had heard again, we had some good reporters in Michigan that just kind of talked about like, oh, if you're wondering why this law got passed that nobody wanted, it's gerrymandering again. So I think, and because in Michigan, we're such a purple state that it's really, and we vote about 50% for Democrats, 50% for Republicans, depends on the election year. But so when you do have a 50-50 state, no matter which side's gerrymandering, you can clearly see it because the other side got over 51% of the vote, and yet the side that gerrymandered ends up having more seats. So I think that was part of it. But one of the things, so as somebody, again, who hadn't really been involved in campaigns, again, voted, paid attention to politics, but I think I always knew that like campaigns were ran in a very calculated way, a very strategic way. But not only seeing Chris and like learning more about Project Red Map, and then Bob LeBrant in our state, whose self-memoir is called Pac-Man, for like packing and cracking, which I just think is like very interesting. But being actually inside of it, I think it opened my eyes in a totally different way. Like in some ways I became even more cynical, because I think what dawned on me is I realized that people, to a lot of political strategists on either side, but I think it's because you so want your side to win that you forget that the voters that you're suppressing are actual people and actual tax-paying people. And so when you're like, ooh, this will help Republicans or Democrats turn out or not turn out, you're actually talking about human beings who live in our state who will have their lives completely impacted by this. Yet somehow by using the terms Republican and Democrat, it just seems like the moral like reality of these impacts just gets a little washed away or something. And how calculating people can be to be like, oh, but our side needs to win, so of course we would go to these lengths or target these voters in this way. And it's actually partially why I've continued my work even beyond us having our win in Michigan in politics, just because I think until more people who don't do this day to day get involved in the process, get the ability to be in those closed room doors, or behind the doors of those closed rooms, I think we're going to keep having the same old problems because people are just trying to figure out how does their side win instead of how does America or the people win.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I mean, I actually worked at the DMV 2011 and 2012 doing redistricting. And so I was aware that there was some level of cynicism on the Democratic side, like, oh, the other side's doing it, so it's fine. Let's let Illinois do whatever they want. But the Chris Jankowski thing, actually, until I saw the documentary, I didn't realize how proud he was to say all of that stuff out loud. Like, when I'm, cross-examining people or doing depositions, I know that that's what they're thinking, but I'm trying to get them to actually say it. And he's just sitting there like, what we were doing? We're getting in there to screw the other side. I was like, what? The other thing with this was that there was an initial case about the Voting Rights Act because they had violated the rights of the Latinx community in Milwaukee in the original Wisconsin map. And when the recalls were happening, there was this very brief period where the Democrats were in control of the Senate. And so the Senate leader said, hey, you've been trying to subpoena all these documents. Why don't you just come and have a look at the computers? And lo and behold, all of these, files turned up that were absolutely responsive to the subpoenas that had been suppressed. In fact, by the time they got there, one of the hard drives my co-counsel says, I can't say they drilled a hole in it, but when they got there, the hard drive had a hole that had been somehow drilled in it. Anyway, so I mean, but when you look at some of those documents, you start to see the sort of, yeah, we're just going to throw some people in there. I mean, I think that email that came out in Michigan was just a great example, right? Let's throw the Democratic trash or whatever in that area. Once you start to see that politicos just see this as numbers on a screen and they just do not see it as people, maybe it makes more sense that Chris Jankowski talks about it that way. But I certainly didn't hear anything about it in 2010, you know, and it's sort of hard to know how much of an effect he had. Like, like it is true that because of the Tea Party, there was going to be a change. It seems like a change in 2010 anyway, and the 0 years are really important because of the census. And so to some extent, I wonder if Chris Jankowski really is trying to sell his wares, like, hey, Republicans, hire me. Like, look what I did. I changed the whole 2010 election. Probably what he did was put money in at the margins in the places, you know, where they only just got control, and it makes a big difference if you just get control of a legislature, because then you can draw the gerrymander for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So to that extent, he did make a difference, specifically in redistricting. But overall, sure, there was a wave in the Republican direction.
Yeah, Katie, you mentioned, well, both of you just talked about this, but kind of the removal of people being actual people in this process, and not just, you know, pawns on a board that help one side win and one side lose. And something I just keep thinking about as we, you know, as we see people just talking about, well, my side has to win, and politics feels like it's a game now, not something you enter or participate in to elect, you know, leaders to lead the country. And what that means that as gerrymandering is continuing to, you know, actually do what it's supposed to do, people have less control over this. So they can't even assert themselves to say, hey, I'm a person, you know, I put you in office, I would like for you to listen to me. So, you know, two questions from that. What should voters feel hopeless that, you know, elected officials can just take that kind of power away and say, we got it now, you can't do anything? And I'll ask the second question after this. It's a little different. So
I think voters should feel urgency. Even after we had our success, and it was a ton of work, one of the immediate things that happened is our legislature actually tried to make the citizen ballot initiative, the fact that we could in Michigan, or can in Michigan, write constitutional language, gather a bunch of signatures, and then vote on an amendment ourselves without having to work directly with the legislature. They tried to make that process harder because we had used it successfully, I guess, even though it was against all odds. But I think even when we were starting, I mean, the cynicism was really real in me too. I think I just was having this thought of like, well, I at least have to try. And if I try my hardest and it still fails, and I still know, and like I get defeated by the system because it's that corrupt, then like, fine, I can live with that, and I'll just like give up on America or whatever, or democracy. But like, I'm gonna at least try. That's pretty consistent in my own personal life. But once I started doing that, I actually realized that there's a lot of stories or narratives that are put into place in order to make people feel like they have less power than they do. And also to make us, I think, scared of the quote unquote other side, whichever side that is, more so than we need to be, especially when it comes to voters. The assumptions from everybody was like, oh, well, any Republican who's in office is going to oppose us no matter what. Any judge that's Republican is going to oppose us no matter what. So don't even bother. Don't even try to play by the rules. And actually, like, a Republican judge, Michigan Supreme Court judge, was the deciding vote to keep us on the ballot. And she risked losing election. She got dropped from her fundraising team. Like, she ruled based on the Constitution and what the law said, and not based on political party pressure. And so I think for me, it was like really reaffirming to experience that too, where I was like, if we never even give people the chance to quote unquote act the way that we hope that they do, then of course they're not going to, because we're not even trying to allow each other to exist in that way. And the really cool part too was what we were working on was really important, ending gerrymandering, but actually the fact that we were organizing, we were going around our state doing the things our politicians weren't. We went to every congressional district at least twice and held public meetings asking people what they wanted in this constitutional amendment. That was at a time when every headline that was dealing with political news said, Michigan representative refuses to hold town hall. So in a time when our politicians are refusing to do that, we did it. what ended up happening though, is once people started understanding the political process, we actually had over 17 people decide to run for local office, whether it was school board or city commissioner, and almost all of them won too. And a lot of them sent me personal messages just saying, I always had some story in my mind that I didn't have it figured out enough, or that I wasn't qualified, or that somebody else needed to come along and fix this. And so by doing the work of trying to make change, I think we actually start not only understanding how the system works more, but also building those democracy muscles, those civic muscles that help us end up be able to be more strategic than maybe other powers that be. The other thing I would say too is don't underestimate, and maybe this sounds a little hokey, but like don't underestimate working for the right reasons. Our opposition was strong from when we started, but their argument didn't hold up because their argument was, well, I mean, gerrymandering isn't that bad. We don't do it. Maybe we do it, but this solution's really bad no matter what. And ours was, you can't get worse from here. And every voter deserves to be able to choose who their politicians are. Voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around. People just got it. I think even when there was skepticism about what our motivations were, they could just see that because we were just doing this to make a more fair Michigan, that they could trust the system. They could try and trust the political system, and they trusted in voting in this too. But again, without other people actually getting involved in trying, I don't think that just magically happens. I don't think our country magically fixes itself. But at least our experience in Michigan was we're actually able to be, I think, more strategic and more powerful because we tried and we weren't afraid of the opposition. I mean, we were afraid of them, but we didn't give up just because they were really big and they had more access to money. And we ended up being able to outmaneuver them because of that.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you, Katie, is get in on the first floor. Democracy is at an all-time low, so it's only up from here.
It's a little bit of that, yeah.
I started working in this in 2008, 2009. Things have gone backwards in terms of laws, like Citizens United happened, Shelby County v. Holder happened, our case. But the awareness of these issues across the country is huge now. And so my estimation, I mean, there's just no way that the 2020 cycle is going to be as bad as 2010 for lots of reasons, right? In Michigan, now there's a commission. You have a governor in Wisconsin, who's a Democrat. You have split control in a bunch of places. There are all these reasons why, aside from Texas and Georgia, which are going to be gerrymandered, though I'll try to stop them. Many other places are just not going to be as bad. And that is because just one person at a time, people have joined in. The other thing I will say on the hope front is that I'll give a shout out to a group that I love, the League of Women Voters. If you go to the participants impact page, there's links to the League of Women Voters for all of the states for the Slay the Dragon movie. But the league is great because they are eyes on. If ever I go to a state and they're like, this thing happened, like North Carolina, for example, I was litigating there and we were like, did anyone turn up to this hearing in the middle of nowhere? And lo and behold, someone from the League of Women Voters was there and she was taking notes and she stood up and said that this was not okay. And at the time it felt futile. But then when we go into court and we can show all of these people were telling, the politicians that what they were doing was wrong, that actually has an effect if you're trying to prove that there was an intent to gerrymander. Now, we know in federal law that cause of action is kind of null and void for, say, 40 years. But it's state law, it's still possible. And so having people there, even just witnessing and being aware and telling the public about stuff is really useful. Even like bloggers and stuff, when I went into states to work at if we could bring cases, I go and find whatever the little local blog is. Like I've heard of that thing you talked about, Pac-Man, because I remember looking through and finding out like what's going on in Michigan and like found out about this guy and his like insane, biography. But that's because there are like citizen advocate activists out there who are making sure that this stuff is recorded and we can know what happened and tell the stories about it.
Yeah. Both of you just kind of touched on activism and kind of the power of people, if you will. And so, Ruth, I'll start with you. You kind of you let us know you're from Australia. So, I would love, and you mentioned kind of feeling like you were here, helping us fix our really crappy system. But, I would love to hear more about how that turned into activism. And I think, different from a lot of people, definitely different from Katie, myself. I don't think Katie has a law degree. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're an attorney, and definitely a lot of people who go to law school and become attorneys in the US, it's expensive. So they go into more lucrative jobs. And so I'm wondering why you decided to use your skills to be an activist, and what made you go that route instead of maybe going to join all the protests that happen around restrictions to voting rights and things like that?
So there's a few things here. One of the things is that I come from a country that has excellent government-funded health education, also healthcare, but education, right? So my law degree was free. They give you about a $5,000 a year charge that you pay off only when you earn a certain amount later in life. So that's amazing. And so I did have to save up and pay money for my master's over here. And basically, as soon as I paid that off, my mom was like, yeah, go on, have whatever impoverished job you want. And I was like, yes, I'm going back to America. So I know, I mean, there are parts of it that in America, you have this rich culture of civic engagement that you don't see in other places. One of my theories for that is a little bit that actually the government doesn't do enough. And so you have these philanthropists who are like, well, I'm going to pay for things to happen. And so the work that, we do here, trying to make democracy more fair, like there are people like in government positions in other countries that are doing that. But here you have to do it, through the public sector. But I actually kind of love it. I love that, you can be like, I'm putting up a Facebook post and finding some people and let's do it. I've been doing these meetings over a state voting rights act in Washington state with some people in Yakima recently. And there is a vibrant community, mostly of farm workers who, they are so engaged in a way that I haven't experienced that, in Australia or in other places. So to me, there is this feeling in America of like, if there's something wrong, like I'm going to hustle until I get it done. And I was like, oh, this feels like my kind of place. I like this. Yeah, and also I don't know a lot about organizing and activism like how Katie does. I don't think that's my strength. I think that I know the law, and that's great, and that could be my strength. I'm good, I think, when I'm standing up for somebody else. And so I like to have clients that I represent and I stand up for them. And so for me, when I was on the voter protection team for Obama in 2012, and on a political campaign, there's all the different things, right? There's field, there's political, there's communications, and all the rest of it. And it was interesting to me that there are just very different types of people in them. And there was also a strange thing that when you finish that, all the poor field people are off to do another campaign for no money anywhere. The data people are like, I'm off to Silicon Valley to make some money. And the lawyers can go off to a law firm and make money, right? Like there's very unequal roles in the sort of activist world. But yeah, from my perspective, basically, because I didn't have to have student loans, it meant that I could go straight into this.
Yeah. Katie, you mentioned you were not in this space before, and you jumped into it. So I would love to know, what was it like to build an organization? Watching you, the way everything was edited together, you put this Facebook post up, and then, a group of people came and said, hey, like, we care about this too. You had meetings, and then even, I don't know why this was interesting to me, but, you got to the point where you needed to focus and be serious about fundraising, and then you had to have attorneys represent you in getting your ballot initiative to help it stay on the ballot. So what was it like building an organization and inspiring people enough to come along on the ride with you?
It was pretty incredible, honestly. I think I've always been a big idea person, and this is probably one of the only times in my life where that big idea actually translated into the big reality, and probably way beyond what I would have ever thought was possible. I actually have to credit a little bit corporate America. My first job was there with the sustainability. I was the sustainability intern, so I looked out for a grocery retailer and distributors, environmental and social oriented business practices. And because they were just starting to do that, I had to build a department from scratch with no money. And I tend to be the person too that's kind of like, oh, our school needs a recycling club, I'll start that. So jumping into things and being like a project manager, figuring out like, okay, here's the vision and here's all the steps that we have to do to get there, that comes naturally to me. I think it's probably like, we could not have done this without the thousands of people who dedicated time and energy and money and creativity. But the one thing I think that I really helped with was the fact that from that day one, I kind of could start plugging in everybody where they belonged. Kind of what Ruth was just talking about how everybody has their own skills and talents. One of the first things I did was asked people. I created like a Google Doc. We were all strangers. My Facebook post actually got shared a bunch. That's mostly who joined. And at the time too, a lot of people like didn't have profile pictures that matched their own face. So I was like, are they all Russian spies? I don't know. Am I being hacked? But so I did a Google spreadsheet and I asked a bunch of questions that were like, who are you? What's your contact info? How many hours a week do you have? What are your skills? Why are you here? What do you want to do? And from looking at that, I started seeing that we just had people from all walks of life. There was a woman who ran the Renaissance Festival in Michigan for like 15 years. And I was like, what? That is so cool. I bet you know something about fundraising for weird stuff. Like, great, we're going to need to fundraise. And then I had, somebody who was a law professor, Nancy Wang, who's now the president of Voters Not Politicians. And I was like, wow, a law professor has responded to my Facebook post. Oh no, like she probably has no idea I don't know what I'm doing. And then, students, a veterinarian, a catering manager. And then reading what they wanted to do. Some of them were interested in policy, even if that had nothing to do with their job. Some of them were interested in things related to their job. So, hey, yes, I used to be a reporter, and I'm happy to dedicate my time to helping write up press releases or whatever. And that's where I started, looking at the plan and plugging people into like, well, what if you could do this? What if you could do that? And that's how it was kind of like crowdsourcing a constitutional amendment. Like my friends, I've grown up in an age where like if their cat needs surgery, they're going to put a post up and like they're going to get funding to do that. So instead of like only doing money, it was also like, we need to write constitutional language. How do we crowdsource that? By taking the time to map that stuff out, I think what we started seeing is that all of our different individual contributions could add up to something even bigger. And again, I'm on the like hokey cheesy train, but I do love democracy, especially after this process. It's gotten very much renewed for me. And we just committed to having a process where everybody's voices could be heard and we would make decisions together. And also with a couple ground rules. One of those rules was that we weren't going to create a solution that would benefit one political party over another. We were creating a system so that no matter what the political parties look like in 40 years, the Michiganders voting under what we've created have an equal chance no matter where they live or how they vote. And those guiding principles allowed us to really take a bunch of different ideas, thoughts, opinions, and create an even better solution. And I actually hope that that's like one day what our country can get to, because like what we saw is that the diversity in thought didn't have to lead to arguments. It could actually lead to like better ideas and more quality policy, more quality, even signature gathering. Our clipboards were designed head to toe because we had a wood carver who cut them out, 5,000 of them, by crowdsourcing it, and had thought about like every detail from the instructions on the front to the little name cards on the back. Everybody's contribution really ended up making our campaign successful, which is part of what's pretty cool too.
Wow. Well, that I feel like for anyone who has a reason why they haven't gotten started on the thing they care about, all you have to do is take the first step. Something else that the film talks about that I don't know this for certain. Maybe people think about it, maybe they don't. But I thought the film did a really good job of linking gerrymandering to so many other things. It opens with the Flint water crisis, which the first time I saw the film, I was just like, man, never would have linked that to gerrymandering. And then Act 10 in Wisconsin, again, something I just wasn't thinking about gerrymandering. Are there other, could you two kind of elaborate more on what's able to happen after gerrymandering successfully takes place and, whoever is in charge gets the politicians they want in place to kind of do their bidding, and just kind of the threat to serving people that comes with that?
Yeah, I mean, the playbook is pretty simple. Step 1, gerrymander. Step 2, suppress the vote, right? Because gerrymandering usually can only be for state legislative or congressional lines. But if you want to affect other elections, you suppress the vote, right? So you do things like purge voters from the rolls, enact photo ID laws, make it hard to register voters through voter registration drives, stop absentee. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Frankly, this country is quite creative in the ways that it seeks to disenfranchise people. In Wisconsin and your state of North Carolina are some of the leaders in the country on ways to stop people voting, right? Because if you have worked out where the lines are, so you know the possible universe of voters, and then you cut out all the ones you don't want voting, you're getting elected every time, and then you can do whatever you want. So something like Act 10, which was the act that basically destroyed public sector unions in Wisconsin, was very unpopular. But they were able to do it because they didn't need to be popular to get elected, right? The Republicans keep on not winning elections, not getting more than 50% of the vote, and yet they get like 63% of the seats in Wisconsin. And that sounds outrageous, but that happens across the country, right? Same in Michigan, et cetera. So you rig the rules and then you just put through unpopular policies. some of the other ones at the time where they were stripping money out of the educational system. I mean, we had Republicans on our side who were like, no, like, I'm totally all about like destroying unions, but don't take money out of education. I was like, okay, well, at least we found some common ground. I don't know. I just, it is very clear that even somewhere like Chicago where I live, right, the machine they always used to talk about likes to know who its voters were, right? Let's have a primary in February when it's freezing cold, so only a certain amount of voters can come out. It's sort of a time-old thing. If everyone can vote, suddenly we don't know the outcomes, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I think, our democracy is founded on the fact that like we as the voters or the people of this country can hold our elected officials accountable with the power of our vote. Mm-hmm. And gerrymandering takes away that power to a really large degree. One of the other things that surprised me with our campaign, we could finally hire a fundraiser. And she was great, but she was a political fundraiser. So her first piece of advice for us was, who's your enemy? Because every fundraising email you send out bashing that enemy is going to raise you more money than any other email you'll write. And I just started thinking about, like, if that's the advice every candidate gets, and then they're raising money from people, so then either the people are giving them money because they believe that that person's going to never stand with the other side ever again, or maybe they are still going to try and compromise with that person, but then the people who donated money are going to feel ripped off. Like, I don't know how this works, how this ends up creating compromise or a system. And I share that story just because I think what gerrymandering and how our elections are run right now, people are running in a way where they just want to be able to push their agenda through. So with gerrymandering in Michigan, a very real example is, even though the majority of voters actually voted for one party, and in the most recent time, Michigan's been gerrymandered by Democrats and Republicans, but the most recent example, the one I'm talking about, when I first started voting, when I had turned 18, it was for Republicans. And we had a Republican governor. So a governor is elected from popular vote. They are not impacted by gerrymandering. Well, because we had a super majority that was elected in our House and our Senate, they were passing such extreme conservative laws that our governor, who was a Republican, was refusing to approve them because he was like, I can't get reelected with how extreme this is and how out of touch it is with the people. And that really opened up my eyes to just like what this means. And if you're like if you're not even being successful with your own party because they're so empowered to just be able to pass whatever they want, or more likely what their funders are asking them to do. And in Michigan, we have term limits, but kind of in a negative way, because then a lot of our politicians end up going into lobbying. So then where's my next job coming from? How much are they paying me? I'm going to pass a law this way. In the grocery industry, there was a law passed that basically took away local power to regulate plastic bag bans for $5,000. $5,000 took away every single local community's individual liberty and right to be able to write laws that impact their community. And I think that's really what it keeps adding up to. So even though it's kind of this like gerrymandering is like this process that feels super removed from a lot of us, it is the foundation of our country. We're supposed to be able to elect people to represent us. And the core of gerrymandering is about representation. How are these lines drawn to represent a community? And so when the intention starts off with not even thinking about community, but thinking about, how can I make sure a Democrat or a Republican is elected in this seat? Then again, the even concept of, now I have somebody who's representing me and my community, my family, what we care about, is just not even part of the calculation.
Yeah. So I want to make sure I ask some of the questions that we got beforehand, but just wanted to ask one more before we get to those. Both of you were working on, two big things in the film. And so I would love for you to just update the audience. Katie, if you could just kind of let people know what's happening with the Independent Commission. And Ruth, I know we saw in the film that the Supreme Court sent your case back down to the lower courts, but then last year, the Supreme Court ruled that it's not up to them to get involved in gerrymandering. So would love for you to just update us on what that means for the case that you were working on in the film.
Yeah, I had a baby last year right after we got our decision. And then I went on maternity leave. And when I was coming back from leave, Nick said to me, so you just like lost this huge Supreme Court case and went on leave. Like, what are you going to do when you get back? And I was like, Nick, It is a campaign. It is a fight. I'm not finished. But yes, so basically, I think of it as there are various ways that you can try to, affect gerrymandering or other areas of voting rights. There's federal cases. Okay, so that seems to be off for now, but actually Nick and I both teach at Harvard Law School now, and I like to think I'm teaching one of the future Kavanaughs, and I'm going to get them to be, a little bit less insane. Anyway, so there's federal cases. There's federal legislation. So HR 1, the first bill that Nancy Pelosi passed was a complete sweeping democratic reform. And the second that there is a trifecta in the federal government, we can revolutionize elections from the congressional level, which is amazing. Then there's state cases, and they actually had a lot of success using similar theories that we had used in the federal cases in Pennsylvania and in your state, North Carolina. And so we are likely to see state cases work better after 2020. And even knowing that that's there is like a stick to say, hey, don't just do this behind closed doors. We're going to sue you and win. So there's that. And then there is what Katie is so good at, which is state policy, right? It's very hard to go to a legislature and say, hey, you want to do a bill to like get yourself out of office? But when you say to the people, are you sick of your politicians? So basically I've been helping, people will listen. So I've been working with other groups to try to get independent commissions. So in 2018, there was redistricting reform in Ohio and commissions in Michigan, Utah, Missouri, and Colorado. Since then, Utah reversed theirs. Missouri is trying to reverse theirs. We are representing Nancy and Voters Not Politicians to sort of defend against the attacks that are coming. So there's that side defending. And then we're also working with more states, but because of the coronavirus, it's reduced. But Arkansas and North Dakota are both trying to put an independent commission on the ballot. And I'm actually arguing a case tomorrow to try to say that we should accept electronic signatures or reduce the number or give them more time, because you can't go up to people, right? And then you have to collect signatures. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing. How about you, Katie?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest parts, so I remember learning about gerrymandering in like fourth grade or something, and then being like, hey, why do we do this if we know it's wrong? And my teacher saying something to the effect of like, well, it's the way it's always been done. Not that I, again, thought anything would happen, but I do have this distinct memory. And so one of the most exciting parts or motivating things for me whenever I was having a really long day was thinking about the new fourth graders in Michigan who could learn that, yes, gerrymandering still is a problem across the country. But in Michigan, there were a lot of people who worked really hard to make it so that voters could actually be drawing these lines instead. So all that to say, though, if we don't want politicians drawing our lines, voters have to be involved in the process and need to be paying attention. We did not just work this hard just so it could still be gerrymandered by the few who are paying attention. So in Michigan, we have a couple really exciting things that are happening. One is this Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, the solution that we passed. There's a couple of restrictions on if you're like currently in office or closely related to somebody, but basically any Michigander could apply to actually be one of the map drawers, to go around, listen to people in their communities, hear how what is and isn't being listened to in regards to representation, how they would want the maps drawn, look at the other criteria that we have, and help make sure this process is done in a fair way with a lot of integrity. And on the other side, too, because this new commission is required to go across the state, we actually get to be in on those meetings that previously happened behind closed doors or in the gerrymandering bunkers. The first time ever, 9.9 million people are actually invited into this process. Now, we've never done that process before, so it takes a lot of education, a lot of talking about commissions and maps and why it actually matters. But if we can mobilize the people of Michigan to pay attention and have these community conversations about how do we really want our representation to look like, it will have a benefit for the next 10 years and hopefully set us up for the next redistricting cycle, for people feeling more powerful and confident that they know how to participate in this. So getting people to apply and definitely making sure that people know how to go and actually talk about these lines and how they would want them drawn. And then the other thing is just I'm working with I started a new organization called thepeople.org. If you go to participants website, you can find us too with the Slay the Dragon campaign. But we wanted to take all of the tools and lessons that we learned and kind of just pay it forward to the rest of the world. It's already hard talking about gerrymandering and figuring out the right law to pass and all of that, but the actual campaigning, how to create an entire organization from just a Facebook post, like campaign finance, all those, how to gather petitions, all those things. It just felt like if we as citizens stand any chance on actually making a country that we can participate in, then it shouldn't be that hard. So our organization, The People, is trying to just connect other people who want to work on systemic democracy issues, and then also help give them like the tools and the lessons that we learned, and help connect them with the people we didn't previously know but now know, to hopefully make a lot more change happen faster.
Well, that is great. I'm glad to hear that both of you have stayed in the fight and are continuing this. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to some questions we got from the audience. The first one, Ruth, if you could answer it, you kind of touched on this in what you were saying in answering the last question, but if you could talk about some states that have fair redistricting approaches and how they do it.
Yeah, so historically it was always, we talked about, strangely, Arizona and California, because they were the only places that had independent commissions. So there are places that have bipartisan commissions, or you know, Iowa, strictly speaking, has a group of independent experts that draw the lines, but the legislature technically doesn't have to listen to what they say. There's a political culture there where they do. But I can tell you right now, in Wisconsin, if you had a bunch of experts tell the legislature something, they'd be like, thanks very much, we'll rip that up and do whatever we want. So what they had in California, and just to really get the Michiganders going. So I think about 5,000 people have applied for your commission. California had 35,000 people apply all up for its original commission. So I just feel like you can do better. Keep going, for another year. But yeah, so basically having actual people from the real community involved is like step one, and then setting out the laws, right? So saying that you can't advantage either party, saying that you have to have extra protections for people of color, ensuring transparency and accountability. Oh, I have this thing actually, designing independent redistricting commissions. It sets out, basically it's like, I should just have a photo of Katie Fahey here and be like, ask Katie. But it's the long, boring version of that. But anyway, yeah. So I should pass over to Katie to explain what they're doing in Michigan, because that's basically the gold standard. Oh, and if you want me to call out bad states, I can just do that all day. So go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, and it's mentioned in the movie just at the very, very end. But what was really cool is even in 2018, when Michigan was going, you had Colorado, Utah, Ohio, Missouri, and who am I forgetting? Oh no,
Michigan.
Michigan. Oh yeah, I know. All trying to pass some form of like a independent commission, and all of them were successful. As Ruth mentioned, unfortunately, Missouri's legislators are trying to muck that up a little bit, but the voters will still actually get to decide if you're a voter in Missouri. Virginia, their legislature just passed a type of commission too, where people on the 2020 ballot will be able to vote whether they want a commission that includes citizens or not. So if you're in Virginia, make sure you do your research and decide how you want to vote. I would suggest going with the non-gerrymandering on a personal level. But there's a lot of states that are making traction this way. I know that there's a lot of citizen activists in Illinois and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, even though the pathways are a little more murky. So lots of actions. And actually, if you go to participant.com/slaythedragon, you can click on your state and it gives you an update of kind of where the current action is at. And I think that that's one of the best ways to really figure out what you can do and how you can make sure your voice is heard. Because again, even if you have an independent commission like Michigan, if they don't hear from you or they don't understand what's important to your community, then even if they have the best intentions in the world, they aren't mind readers, and they might not draw as good of maps as they would have if you and your community's voices were heard.
Yeah. The next question is directed at Katie, but I think both of you could probably answer it. And now I've lost here it is. The person whose question it is said the documentary was great and is grateful to you all. But one specifically to Katie said, when you started all of this, you said you were a political outsider. What was the benefit about being a political outsider, and what was difficult about it?
Yeah, it's something I've actually thought about a lot, because so the first thing was, I think because I was so new to it, it's kind of like when you're new to any industry or job, like you don't know what you don't know. And so I was walking in with kind of like my expectations of democracy and my expectations of how citizen initiatives, work. Oh, the word citizens in it. It must be thousands of citizens all the time, going from community to community, coming together to write constitutional language. And I quickly realized that it's hardly ever that. And oftentimes a lot of people who maybe have really great intentions, but tend to just think they're the smartest in the room and then just pass something. So when coming in, what was clear to me is that there was a lot of organizations who really cared about redistricting and had been doing work for decades. Without their work being done, there wouldn't have been enough people to even respond to my Facebook post to know what gerrymandering was. But at the end of the day, because I wasn't being paid to be there, because when I was at that meeting, I was taking a vacation day from work to try and fight for democracy, all my decisions and the way I was making decisions and the other people in our campaign was geared towards what's best for Michigan and how do we make sure this happens before 2020 when the next set of lines will be drawn. And that was like a really hard deadline. And some of those other organizations were considering that, but then we're also thinking about, well, how do we keep our employees employed? Or how do I make sure that, you know, my boss who donates to the Democrat governor candidate or the Republican governor candidate is going to stay happy? And that's really why I think redistricting reform hadn't passed sooner, because too many people were letting other agendas get in the way of actually just getting the work done and passing something, and not letting excuses of it's hard to find compromise or somebody's going to be unhappy get in the way. For me, it was kind of like, well, the consequence again is that I'm going to wake up in 2020 or 2021 and another Flint water crisis is going to happen. And I'm not going to let that happen. I think that's what a lot of us, for our motivation, it was kind of like it can't get worse than the status quo, and we're just going to try as hard as we can. And so I think that was a really big benefit at the end of the day, because we were willing to be political in the way of like not letting politics get in the way, not letting having to be nice to somebody get in the way. We knew that our Constitution gave us the right to try, so we were going to try. While still, of course, inviting everybody in and all that. It don't mean to sound negative. And I think the other thing too was we were problem solving a lot from other sectors. So, you know, our head marketing person, who is really amazing, Amelia Quilon, she worked for one of the motor companies, one of the car companies, doing their social media and stuff, and some of their metrics and their analytics. Well, although she never worked on a political campaign, that skill translated very well to having to figure out a political campaign. And I think we did things in a way that was just much more in touch with voters. A lot of political campaigns are so worried about getting so much data on everyone and so much polling information to tell us how people think. And I think we were those people who were doing the thinking. So it was easier to come up with messages and things that resonated with people because we were those people. We were being impacted by those decisions. We weren't removed from them.
Yeah. And Ruth, being, you know, from another country, what was it like, and, you know, what was difficult and what was the benefit of, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call you a political outsider because you've been working in this.
Really, I'm quite the outsider. It's like when I turn up to places, hi, I'm White Ruth from Australia. Like I am not part of anyone's community. I mean, I think one of the things that helped is that a lot of things work better. Like there are plenty of problems with Australia, but many of the democratic systems work better. And so I know that there's a better thing out there. I feel like I can always head towards that. I never get discouraged like it's not possible. Also, just, you know, there are so many really complex issues in public policy, which is half the reason lots of people listen to all the Crooked Media podcasts. But in democracy, it's not that hard, right? It's like involving people. When it feels right, it's right. You know, there are things around the edges. But if they said to me, Ruth, you're the elections rewrite the whole code tomorrow, I could write you a pretty good code. I'm sure everybody who's listening could write you a pretty good code. So the fact of it being not that hard. And then the other thing is that people are just people, you know, in the end, even though I turn up from, you know, wherever I'm from and whatever, you know, I have a dog and they have dogs, and, you know, I'm really excited to eat their food and they're excited to hear about, you know, whether we walk upside down in Australia or whatever. You know, I think the thing is maybe I'm like a little bit more humble because I'm just like, you have no idea who I am. I'm such an outsider here. And so then I listen to people and maybe that helps. Maybe that's something that comes really naturally to someone like Katie, who's amazing. But I, you know, I think that just going in and actually listening to people and finding out what they want and then being like, okay, well, you know, there are places where this is done better. There's got to be some way, right? Let's just keep trying.
I totally echo it. I think the like knowing what you don't know and not pretending that you, or whatever, like the listening part is so key to making it work.
Maybe more politicians will start doing that. We have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to ask this final question. It's actually my question, but in the latter half of the film, Jerry Herbert talks about stepping up to the plate when we know we have a chance to do it. So for everyone who tunes into this later, is tuning in now, what can people do to step up in this moment? And one other thing I'll just kind of add to that, what can they do to step up in this moment, knowing it's 2020, another census is coming, and this is a big election, not just because not just because who's in the White House could change or Democrats could take control of the Senate.
Can I just jump in? Jerry Hebert is one of my bosses, and he celebrated his 34th wedding anniversary this weekend. He met his wife. He was litigating desegregation cases in the South. So if you want to talk about facing an uphill battle, he lost all his cases initially. But he met his wife because she was a federally appointed poll monitor after the Voting Rights Act, and she was poll monitoring in Mississippi, and they were both like, things have to be better, right? Things have to be done better. And so they have, he joined the DOJ just before the Saturday Night Massacre happened. He was there through Reagan. But by being there, he knows cases inside out. He knows courts inside out. So even though there are these like dark times, we need people to be there to know what is happening and to kind of keep the flame alive for when the times are better. And then there's just also small things like, as Katie mentioned, go to the participant page and you can find your local League of Women Voters. I became a citizen last year as well, so I am now a League of Women Voters member, and I'm going to join my little annual general meeting by Zoom next month, which is very exciting. Common Cause is another amazing organization, and I turn up to protest, do all of those sorts of things to keep yourself in the game. And then when it does turn out that Katie Fahey needs someone to carve her wooden clipboards and you have that skill, like, oh my goodness, this is your time. But until then, there's a lot you can do along the way.
Yeah, I think so for sure. I mean, I right now, so in any presidential year, I think it can be really easy to just let that conversation consume you. And I would just say that being really conscious of that and how much of an impact you will really have that way or not is important to just be considering right now, because since this is a year ending in 0 and the census is going on and the people elected in the majority of states across the country in 2020, maybe some of the ones who are deciding how these lines will be drawn, it's going to impact the next 10 years worth of elections. So the next biggest opportunity for this much change is going to be in 2030. And there's a lot of people who are going to start voting right now, or maybe are just starting to vote, who are going to be potentially in gerrymandered districts or in undercounted population areas. So they don't have enough representation because they didn't get the census out for the next 10 years. And there's still a ton of change that they can make, but the amount of hard work that we all can do right now to be conscious of this moment, to know that redistricting is happening and that the census is happening, and the census gives us the data so that those lines can start to be drawn. So if you're missing a couple 100,000 people or tens of thousands of people, then it makes gerrymandering even easier, because it is still a number game. You do still need to make sure each district roughly has the same number of people. So the less people, especially if they happen to represent, or if there's assumptions that people make about how people vote, then they can like move those lines to try and suppress those votes. And so I would just say that being conscious, and even if it's like an hour a week or an hour every 2 weeks, where you're going to do something that's beyond just talking about the issues, I think is a huge investment in the future of our country. There's, at every single state, there are communities who aren't going to be counted enough in the census, and there's organizations that are trying to desperately make sure that amongst the COVID crisis too, that these communities aren't left out, even though there's literally life and death to be worrying about right now. Same with redistricting too. Even if your politicians in your state are going to be the ones drawing those maps, as Ruth said, public testimony, going and making sure your voice is heard, becomes a record that can later be used in a lawsuit. And you saying and advocating for something and your politician ignoring it is actually evidence that they ignored what you said, even though you did show up. And it might sound silly, but it makes a huge difference. It makes the ability for the future to be brighter even possible. But if everybody stays home or just argues with people on Facebook or whatever, and again, I love Facebook. That's how I met a bunch of really amazing people. But if we only let that part of it consume us, then I really think we're missing a huge opportunity to make a difference. And even if you don't know where to start, that's partially too why I started the people.org again, but like so that we could find out together. So figure out what issue you think is really speaking to you the most, whether it's voter suppression, gerrymandering, wanting to make sure there's just accurate data, which I would point you towards the census. All of those things need attention, and every single community needs attention. The other thing, sorry, I'm ranting, but the last thing too is that so many communities might not be ready for the 2020 election based on whether people can vote safely and securely, whether in person or by mail. And going to your county clerk, who is the one who like looks out for your individual voting, like such a weird thing. Like I don't go and talk to my county clerk ever. But when I was working on this constitutional amendment, it's not like I knew what the Bureau of Elections was in Michigan either. You know, I had to do it because that was the only way change was possible. Going to your county clerk and asking the questions about how are we taking this on? What can I do as a citizen to advocate for you to have enough resources so that our community can do this safely? I'm in Michigan. If you live in Detroit and you have even a half an hour of time in the next several months, like you better be helping make sure that we can get safe elections because it is so freaking important. So anyways, rant almost done. I think just thinking about those little impacts and how, again, like there's a ton going on nationally and that is important, and please show up to vote. But there's so much happening locally too that a lot of organizations are probably ignoring just because there's so many communities out there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you again for both of you joining us today. And, you know, this was mentioned, Katie really just said this very eloquently, like there's a lot happening this year. You know, anyone who knows Crooked knows we want Donald Trump out of the White House and we want Mitch McConnell, you know, he may stay in the Senate, but at least not in the majority. So, you know, if you have the time, capacity, money, whatever you have to have an impact on the election, we hope that you will take some type of action. So Slay the Dragon actually has a website that you can go to learn more, slaythedragonfilm.com. And yeah, I hope that you will check that out, find out ways that you can get involved. And even if it's a small action, do something. And for those of you who are interested, Crooked Media, we have Vote Save America, which is our voting campaign. It's kind of everything election related. And next week on Tuesday, we'll be launching a new program specifically around 6 battleground states, but 3 of them are 3 of the states that were featured in the film: Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. So if you're interested in specifically getting involved in those states, if you head over to votesaveamerica.com, if you just enter your email address, you will get an email next week about what we're launching. We'll have very specific calls to action that you can take in each of those states. And, you know, they will be focused toward getting people up and elected. So thanks again for everyone joining us, and hope you enjoyed the movie. And if you didn't watch it, I hope you will check it out now. And I hope I don't get this wrong. I think well, in one of the emails we sent you, it has where it's streaming. I think Amazon, but I don't want to mess that up. But if you Google Slay the Dragon, you can find out where to stream it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.